In this short online module, we will learn the history of children's literature, where we have been, and where we are headed. About 500 years ago, childhood as we know it today did not exist. Children's activities were much the same as adults. They drank alcohol, they smoked, and they used foul language. At about the age of 7, this is when children went to work. This is about the time that literature started to experience a change. Before the 1470s, books were not written for children. However, times started to change. 1476 is when William Caxton established the first printing press in England. He, having the ownership of the printing press, also began to publish books for children, the first of which is called A Book of Courtesy, and it is filled with do's and don'ts for aristocratic boys. We also see a shift in thinking during this time period. Now there is a new idea of childhood. There is no longer the thought of children as miniature adults, and so you're going to see literature aimed at children becoming more popular. Though the shift will be slow, children's literature still is instructional or religious in nature. For example, the Puritans felt that the literature given to children should help make sure that they are not corrupted by the devil. What you see here on your screen is a horn book. These were small paddles, usually 2.5 inches by 5, made of wood, and you can tell that it has the alphabet and some religious text on the surface of the wooden paddle. They were covered with what you can think of as like a plastic transparency overlay, but in reality it was a material similar to that of an animal horn, just very thin, used to protect the sheet of instruction. These horn books often had a leather strap to them that children could use to tie the book or the horn book around their neck for travel. They were peddled by traveling salesmen. The other picture you see on your screen is an example of a chapbook. Chapbook stands for, or is a shortened way of saying cheap books. These were also peddled by traveling salesmen, and they were made of folded sheets of paper that were inexpensive to produce, and they were really light to carry around. So you're starting to see the trend shift from the horn book to the chapbook, and I hope you can see that eventually you'll have books as we know them today. At the end of the 17th century, we have an English philosopher come on the scene. John Locke published a work on education in England, and this was influential across the Atlantic. He recommended that children be given books that are enjoyable to read. Books that were published in the mid-1700s to early 1700s, originally for adults, such as Gulliver's Travels and Robinson Crusoe, were adopted by children, and that's what they read at the time. But now we're starting to see books like the one you see on your screen that are more child-friendly. In the mid-1700s, the New England Primer is the most widely read book of the period, and it combines alphabet, so it's instructional skills, with catechism, which is your religious side. So we start to see the blend of the two. Nearly 50 years after John Locke's publication about child-friendly books, we have John Newbery come on the scene. Some even say that Newbery paved the way for children's literature as we know it in the 19th and the 20th centuries that will follow. He published books that were aimed at a child audience. So now, instead of just being text or just being religious or even a blend of religious and alphabet, they are beautiful books. Pictures are pretty. They're enjoyable to read, something very different from what we've seen before. Two of Newbery's better-known works are A Pretty Little Pocketbook and the one that you see here on the screen, The History of Little Goody Two Shoes, which is where we get the phrase little goody two shoes, which means somebody with refined behavior, manners, or polish. One of these two books, and I cannot remember which one now, I actually have an example of in the American Girl doll collection as an accessory, which is really cute. So if you'll remind me in class, I'll pull that and show it to you. From the 1800s up until the 1920s, we have what's known as the golden age of children's literature. During this time, we have publications by the authors that you see on the screen, Alison Wonderland and Little Women and things like that, Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer. These are titles that are still some of the most popular books of all time. We see the trend for Golden Age literature, the much beloved books like the ones you've seen on the screen. It's continuing into the early 1920s. Even though it supposedly ends with Winnie the Pooh, we are going to see in the next slide several books that were published in the 1930s and 1940s that are still popular. I bet with some of the titles, the book covers that you see on the screen, you have memories of your own childhood reading. I can remember reading, and then to think I saw it on Mulberry Street in my own childhood. And my girls love to read Curious George and Madeline, and they're 5 and 6. These titles are going to continue to be classic examples of children's literature. There is one distinction I want you to think about as you reflect on these examples of classic literature that we've just talked about. And that goes up into the 1950s and 1960s. Children's literature featured as characters mostly white children, in fact, almost exclusively white children. In the mid 1960s, when the civil rights movement is taking place, we have a publication that comes out on the Saturday Review, and we'll read this together in class. It was this publication that drew our attention to the discrepancy, the lack of non-white characters in children's literature. And then shortly after that publication, we see the Council on Interracial Books for Children being established. And the goal of that council is to persuade writers and artists of color to produce works for children. It's not until 1982 that the American Library Association begins offering the Coretta Scott King Award, which is an annual award given to outstanding African American author, illustrator, books for children. It also, part of the criteria is that the recipients of this award demonstrate an appreciation for African American culture and values that are universal to the human race. As with anything, I want you to zoom out and really take a look at the big picture. Why do we need to know the history of children's literature? Well, it's very important that we know that where we've been and where we're going. So as we continue to study about diversity and getting multicultural texts, you need to read the best of what's already out there, reading backwards, reading forwards in a sense of time, reading what came early on in literature, reading what's current, so that you know what to include in your classroom library that will meet the needs of the children before you. This is a difficult task, especially if you're not quite sure where to seek advice on what are the texts to read. And so what you have before you is a list of resources. Some of them we are going to discuss in the class. Award winners would obviously be the Caldecott or the Newbery or several of the other awards. I can't possibly list them all, but if you look at the criteria for the award and then the selections, make sure you always read it before you read it to children, but that's a good place to start. Other resources include our textbook or journals, and I've listed several for you. Teacher organizations are also a good place to look for book suggestions. For this next section, we'll look at the books that kids need and their age level. What's appropriate for a younger reader? What's appropriate for an older reader? And how do you make these decisions? For young children, birth to at about age 4, parents need to establish read aloud rituals. Do we read in the morning? Do we read at snack time? Do we read during bath with the plastic books that don't matter if they get wet? What about after bath time when you have pajamas on? Do we sit down and we read together? Those kind of patterned interactions develop attachment for children, a bond between parent and child. And that's also where kids begin to learn language. It is in this read aloud ritual that children start to know how books work, that we read from left to right, that they have a title page, that there's a cover, that pictures tell more about what's going on with the text, those sorts of things. We find as educators that children who come to school not ready to learn, those that don't know about the alphabet, they don't know their letters or their sounds, it is often because there was a lack of read aloud time or lap time with mommy or daddy at home. There is a lot of information on this slide, and I suggest you pause it just to take a minute to read through the evidence that's cited here. Once you've had a chance to pause it and look through this information, take note of the very last bullet, the cause and effect relationship with reading difficulty and school failure. Reading to children is supremely important if we are going to combat the cycle of poverty and dependency. As children enter school, we are going to need to use books in our classroom that provide information for story grammar, and we're going to talk about that more as we get into literary elements, but basically that's characters and setting and plot, books that will help us to teach those skills. But what they enjoy, and you'll not find this hard to believe, is the good versus evil. That's why children like fairy tales. That's why Disney is so popular in the Pixar films, because you have a protagonist and an antagonist. It's what they have difficulty with, the children have difficulty with, is knowing the difference between fact and fantasy. Is this true? Is it not true? As a teacher of early childhood, you'll need to model for children how to connect the story to their own life. That's something that they'll have to do later on in their school years. But also, just the fact that learning that these letters before them that represent words in spoken language, you'll need to teach them how to read from back to front, top down, left, right. Later on with graphic novels, this skill of knowing how to read a book gets a little bit more difficult, so modeling will help set up the foundation for these skills. Even visualizing stories, that's why kindergarten teachers love to have children to draw pictures of what they're thinking, because they're modeling how to visualize what they see on a piece of paper. Books that teach the alphabet, especially those that are rhyming books, help kids learn to read by figuring out the code of the English language. For example, Dr. Seuss books with the cat, hat, sat, mat, and the CVC words, consonant, vowel, consonant, teaches word families, and students are able to then build on foundational skills and grow to understand larger words. So once they get that, they can move to an easy reader book with smaller vocabulary, but the plot is more interesting to them. Erik Erikson's theory of psychosocial development says that between the ages of about 6 and 11, children begin to become capable of performing more complex tasks, and this is the industry versus inferiority stage. They're going to strive to master new skills. So if you look at children as learners developing psychosocially, they're going to begin to relate the text to themselves, and they're going to want to become better as people and as readers. By third grade, the goal for educators is to have students in your class who are independent readers. And we know that the reality of that is not true, even though it is something we still strive for. As a fifth grade teacher for many years, I had students in my class who were beginning readers, who may have known their sounds but still struggled with CVC words. The beauty of what we do is that we work with humans, not robots. So even though we have a goal that all children will be independent readers by the end of third grade, and we know that that may or may not happen, we still strive toward that. In the end, the importance is that your student can understand what is read. So being able to read a text and relate it to what they know, being able to look at a book and know that it's fiction, which will mean that everything in it is fake, or if it's historical fiction, that the time and the place and the event may be true, but the people and the characters, what happens to them may or may not be true. The visualization, all of these things that you see on the screen are evidence of children being able to comprehend or understand what's being read, and that ultimately is our goal. With that, the online module for History, Children's Literature is now complete. If there was anything in this module that was of interest or anything you had a question about, please do bring it up in class and we'll talk about it more there.